Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, students, whenever you're watching this video. This is Mr. McRitchie, and this is my first of what's going to be really two videos that cover the entirety of Unit 6 in AP Macroeconomics. For this part, I'm going to introduce the concept of international trade, talk about why we might pursue it and what the downsides would be if we were to go away from it. Additionally, things like tariffs and quotas and how those impact us, both in the real world and how it will impact one of our graphs from the course we've already learned, the aggregate demand supply model. Additionally, in this video, I'll be covering the balance of payments accounts, which are a specific accounting terminology that they do bring up in this unit as a means of tracking imports and exports, as well as a couple of other international transactions that matter. So this video will be going over international trade and balance payments accounts. The next video I do will be over the Forex market, which is the final graph for the AP Macroeconomics course. And then you're effectively done with AP Macro after that. So pay close attention. If you got questions, throw them in the comments below. Let me know if you got anything you need, and let's get started. So, with that in mind, international trade balance payments accounts. Here we go. Let's start off with the very basics, which is, okay, international trade, what are our thoughts? So there's really sort of a spectrum when it comes to international trade. On the far right, I'm just making up directions here, you have free trade, and on the far left, you have protectionism. If you're trying to compare to like other economic systems, free trade is typically a proponent of capitalism, and protectionism is typically a proponent of very hardcore socialism. Mostly only works if you're a completely communist or authoritarian country. So, now, not to say that we don't do things that are protectionist, it's just to give you like sort of the who do I align these two typically. So, the concept of free trade is the idea that trade internationally should be made without any barriers, any blockages whatsoever. I can buy goods from the UK, they can buy goods from us, just like I can buy goods from a market down the street. Like, it shouldn't be really any different other than, time when it comes to shipping stuff. That's the only real difference. Okay, so it's left to its natural course. It means there is no government intervention. Free trade is governments off of the wheel when it comes to international transactions. And in order for free trade to really happen in the present day, you have to have something called a free trade agreement, a legal document signed by leaders of different governments to agree to not mess with trade in between their countries. So the largest example for this for a long time for America was NAFTA, which is a North American Free Trade Agreement that basically said between us, Mexico, and Canada, we're all Gucci here. There's no issues. You can trade between each of us. Now that came under fire near the end of the Obama administration and going into Trump's election back in 2016, because it was seen as being unfair to America. And the reason why it was seen as unfair to America is by putting us on an equal playing field with Mexico. Canada wasn't really a question, but with Mexico specifically, since Mexico had fewer labor regulations and a lower minimum wage, by evening the playing field between us, it would encourage American businesses to move headquarters and factories to Mexico. While it did move some factories, like a Ford factory went down to Mexico as a result of NAFTA, ultimately it didn't cause like headquarters to really be relocated. It was just some of the manufacturing jobs that were drying up here anyway, places like Detroit in the Midwest, were being relocated to Mexico. So it's like a fair criticism, but in all honesty, that happens with other countries all the time too. You have the WTO. The EU is actually a free trade agreement within members of the EU. And you have some countries that are not a part of the EU that have to make separate deals with the European Union to allow for them to have a free trade agreement with them. And APEC, which is Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Japan, those kind of countries, having a similar thing to NAFTA. Now, conversely, you have the idea of protectionism, which does come up situationally. We're going to talk about some examples of it that we do, as well as some reasoning as to why you might do it. And that would be the idea of you want to protect your domestic industries. The problem with free trade is that an issue that businesses will tend to have is the issue of competition. If you have another business that is better at making your products or can make them at a lower cost, you're going to lose out to them. Now, if it's all within one country, you have at least somewhat an equal playing field. You're dealing with equal laws, equal regulations, etc. But when you open it up to the world, we don't have one government that runs the entire world. So you'll have different laws, different rules, and therefore different circumstances. So a company in China that has much lower labor laws and labor costs than America would have inherent advantages versus American counterparts that have to pay the workers a certain amount, that have to provide access to healthcare in a lot of cases, things like that. So you might use protectionism to try to allow for your industries to still make money at home. Whenever you engage in protectionism, though, it should be mentioned that it's a two-way street. When you're trying to protect yourself from other countries, you're going to make it harder for yourself to sell things to other countries. So putting up those shields doesn't just block money from leaving, it blocks money from going in. So it's a very situational thing. It's not a practice that you should try to engage in very often if you're a more capitalist nation. An example of countries that have done this historically, North Korea is almost exclusively protectionist. They only really engage in trade with China. That's it. And even then, it's very strict deals on that. Cuba, for a long time, was heavy protectionist. They would only engage in trade with other communist nations. The Soviet Union was heavily protectionist, things like that. So it should be mentioned that present-day China is only kind of protectionist. They have free trade zones, parts of the country that actually are allowed to engage in complete free trade. It's why they're able to export to us so much. If they were completely protectionist, you wouldn't be able to go buy Chinese goods at the supermarket. No, not supermarket, at Walmart. I just said supermarket, whatever. Okay, so some specifics when it comes to protectionists, because free trade is pretty easy. There's just no rules. It's a free game. So some policies that can interfere with that. Some specific trade barriers. Like when we say there's barriers to trade, like what the heck are we talking about? There's two that you should know. One of them you should be familiar with already. It's called a tariff. That's a tax on imported goods. That's what a tariff is, a tax on imports. The idea being is we're buying a lot of stuff from another country. Let's put a tariff on it, which makes the good more expensive for our consumers. This is an important thing to understand with a tariff, because a lot of people just have the idea of like, okay, that good becomes more expensive, and they think that burden is on the other country. But when you put a tariff, say we put a tariff on Chinese goods, like we did back 2 years ago in 2018. Okay, we put a tariff on Chinese goods. Specifically, it was like aluminum and a couple of manufacturing goods that we were also making. Steel was another one. That made steel and aluminum from China more expensive for American consumers that were trying to buy it. The idea there is that if an American wanted to buy a Chinese good, they'd have to pay this extra tax, which would then encourage them to not buy the Chinese product. The Chinese product could still get here, people could still buy it, it just rose the price of it so that people would not do it. So whenever you're putting a tariff on a good, be aware that the burden of cost is actually on your consumers. So people are rooting for tariffs. Like, be aware they're making your good more expensive to buy. You're making it harder on you as a consumer. A quota is similar to a tariff in that it's meant to limit imports, but it does so by actually limiting the number of the good. A quota might say, we will only allow for the purchase of 500 million tons of steel from China. That is our limit. We will not be allowing more than 500 tons of steel from China to enter into our borders in this year. So it's a literal hard cap on the number. Doesn't technically change the price of the good, but limits how much of it we can buy, which when you limit the supply, that tends to raise the price. So it's a different system. They both have a similar effect. So if I'm managing my aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, remember, and this is an important thing for this unit as a whole, this is kind of like the big thing for this unit, net exports, imports and exports are an aggregate demand shifter. Because if we're buying more foreign goods, we're demanding less from our own economy, so aggregate demand is falling. If foreigners are buying more stuff from us, there is greater overall demand from stuff in our economy, so aggregate demand would increase. So for this unit, when we're talking aggregate demand supply model, be aware that we're talking almost exclusively about aggregate demand shifters. So if there is a tariff or a quota, and that should say hurts, that's a typo. If a tariff were to hurt imports more than exports, meaning the tariff is successful, because the idea for a tariff is that it's supposed to do this. It brings down imports more than it brings down exports. This means that we're exporting more than we're importing. Follow? This tariff is working so that we're exporting more than we're importing. That would lead to an increase in aggregate demand. Because for aggregate demand supply curve, imports are bad, exports are good. Imports are a negative, exports are a positive. It's saying the negative thing is going down by more than the positive thing. Okay, so the positive thing is winning. So AD would be climbing. It's bringing down imports by a large enough margin. Your net exports are rising. Remember that net exports is exports minus imports. This would lead to an increase in net exports. If it's hurting exports more than imports, which can happen, we'll explain how in a second, then that would decrease AD. So questions on the AP exam will generally say stuff like, if a tariff hurts imports more than it hurts exports. okay? Or it hurts exports more than it hurts imports. They'll say things like this to tell you if the tariff is sort of being successful or not, or what is the tariff actually doing. Because in the real world, we have this idea that tariffs will work, but like anything else when it comes to a policy, they don't always work the way you intend. In fact, most of the time, a tariff will decrease overall spending levels in your economy. It'll make things more expensive for you, etc. Now, why would you limit trade at all then? If tariffs are not always effective, if we lose money on them a lot of the time, why would we do them at all? There's a handful of reasons, and these are like your quick 5 of why you should limit trade. Of when is it good to do a tariff, when is it good to go protectionist. Protectionist is about protecting things, so the first 2 ones are about that. Protecting domestic employment, this is the pitch you get every time a tariff is put into play, is they're trying to protect American jobs, that China is stealing jobs from hardworking Americans, which is the same sort of discourse that's been happening for like hundreds of years when it comes to foreign influence ever in our economy. It's almost always demonizing another group. So they're taking our jobs away. It's like, I don't say they're taking our jobs away. Americans are just choosing to buy a cheaper thing. That's not really China's fault. That's kind of on us. We choose to buy things that are cheaper. I'm sorry that they can make things cheaper than us. So we put a tariff into play to try and protect domestic jobs, because if it's successful, if we are hurting imports more than exports, then businesses in America are overall net winning. If you're buying fewer imports, you'll buy more stuff from American companies. So if we can successfully put a tariff into play and if people can afford those American goods, then those American jobs should be able to exist. That's the idea. And again, I say that if tariffs are successful, because again, they're not always successful the way we want them to be. The second reason, protecting consumers. We buy cheap products. That doesn't always mean we buy good products. So an example of this would be like Wish.com, which is a website where you can buy a lot of super cheap goods. It's basically Chinese Amazon from China. The problem with it is a lot of those times those goods are not properly vetted, meaning they don't have the same level of government regulation on safety and like quality of products as an American business like Amazon has on it. So when we're talking about a thing like that, we might buy something very cheap, but that cheap thing might have lead in it. Because maybe a certain government doesn't have the same like banning of lead paint in products, or buying equipment where asbestos is banned here because it can cause cancer, but in other countries it might not be banned. So it's meant to protect us from ourselves, because we'll buy cheap stuff all the time. That cheap stuff might be bad. Okay. Third one, and this is what I think is logically and effectively the best reason to limit trade, in terms of this is where it makes the most sense logically. The infant industry argument. So, this does not apply to America. This is why limiting trade for us is generally a bad idea, because the best reason doesn't apply to us. Infant industries are whenever your country is starting a new sector of its economy, say it's a country that is wanting to get into making computers, it is really hard to just to jump into that market if you have complete international free trade, right? Because people are going to be able to buy cheaper computer products from other countries. So, because whenever you get starting with a business, you're not going to have low margins. You're going to have incredibly high margins. And you're going to have to really be careful about, all right, we're trying to sell this product, but we can't sell it at a super low cost because we need our business to grow. Whereas a company like Amazon can sell things for dirt cheap, right? That's why Dell computers are so cheap, because Dell is such a big company. They can sell at such a lower cost. So the idea is you put tariffs and barriers to trade into play. You go protectionist while that industry is getting built up, while it's growing. Then you take down those barriers, and now you can actually trade with other countries, because now you can compete with them. You basically give yourself time for your industry to grow domestically before you open it up internationally. I say that in terms of it's not really an American thing, is because when we're starting new businesses, we have a pretty good fast track for this stuff because of all of our connections internationally. Additionally, we were the first one to make most industries. We were pioneers in most industrial fields. So we didn't need to be an infant industry because we were the first to do most of the businesses that are existing in the world today. Now, if you're a new nation that's industrializing, a smaller country, say one in Africa that didn't get to industrialize until like the mid-1900s as opposed to the 1800s because of things like colonialism and resource exploitation, if you're one of those countries, it makes perfect sense to go protectionist for a while, for 20, 30 years. Nigeria has been doing this, or had been doing it, and they've recently opened themselves up a little bit more internationally, and their economy is starting to grow because of it. where they had put in some barriers to trade, had allowed for their businesses to grow up, and then take down those barriers and start to trade with other countries. China did this back when they switched to communism in the 1950s. They put up full USSR-style barriers for a good 30 years, allowed for their incredible amount of people to then build up massive industry and then take down those barriers. And hello, Americans, welcome to a lot of really cheap goods from China. So it works. It's actually an effective policy. It'll suck for a window of time because your people will have to pay for more expensive goods, but it is generally good. Fourth reason, national security. This comes down to stuff like the U.S. government probably, hopefully, doesn't want you to buy security cameras from Russia, right? Because there's a possibility that there's a system in that camera that allows for that feed to go somewhere else. Or doesn't want you to buy a gun from North Korea. They don't want you to buy stuff from countries where we are in difficult military situations with. Countries where we might not want you to buy stuff from them because those things could be tampered and not safe. So the national security thing kind of goes into protecting consumers in that you might do those trades with countries that are not our allies. You don't want countries that are your enemy to succeed economically. Since America has such crazy purchasing power, we might put tariffs and barriers to trade on countries that we see as a risk. This is the idea with the Cuba embargo for a long time, where we weren't able to buy goods from Cuba legally because they were heavy communists right nearby us and strong allies with the Soviet Union for a long time. So we put a bunch of barriers to trade on them to try and basically cripple their economy to the point of not allowing them to flourish, because if they flourish, then they can help out our enemies. That's the idea. Last one, 5, and this is ultimately the reason why tariffs don't work. This is the reason why in the real world tariffs are so ineffective, especially for us. Because when we put a tariff on another country, the first thing, the immediate thing they do after that is they put a tariff on us. So any gains we might have get immediately mitigated, if not completely canceled out, by that tariff. So when we entered into that sort of, let's say, trade war, that's what it was labeled as, but that little tiny trade kerfuffle with China back in 2018, where Trump put a bunch of tariffs on things like steel and aluminum that I mentioned. They countered with tariffs back on us, on soy, and on aluminum as well, because that had gone back and forth. Which you're like, soy, why does that matter? It's like, well, I think 40% of American agriculture is heavily leaned on soy for its exports. 40% of our exported agricultural goods is soy, and most of that is to China, because they use soy a lot, and their environment isn't as conducive for making soy as ours is. So we've been exporting that for a long time. Well, when they put that tariff on American soy, American farmers got wrecked by it. The American steel industry made some gains because of the tariff on Chinese steel. The American agricultural sector got slammed by this tariff on American soy. So basically, the gains in one sector were offset by losses in another sector, and the tariff was taken away. We canceled out that tariff a couple of months later. Okay, we basically were like, whoops, that didn't work, cancel it. And they were like, cool, canceling the tariff back on you guys, that was fun, huh? And it creates a lot of issues for us because countries like China don't necessarily have to care if their people get cheap goods or not, because they're not a democratic country. So they don't necessarily, people in that country don't get to have a say in who's in charge. So if they're taking L's left and right individually for their consumers, it doesn't super matter. But in America, where we vote, and we have a say in who's in charge, if you cost us money, we will resent you for that and vote in a way to throw you out of office in the next election, which that might not have been the primary reason, but there was some gains for the Democrats in farming communities, in agricultural sectors in this last election. Okay, in Georgia, which is a heavy agricultural state, that's flipped Democrat in 2020 election. That is possible that at least part of those gains are within farming communities that were actively hurt by the trade war with China. There you go. Things have a cost. Cool. So that's another typo. I need to go back and fix this PowerPoint. That is your sort of introduction to free and protectionist trade. The next section of this will be over the balance of payments accounts. So if you want to put a little break or indent in your notes, go for it. The next chunk will be over the balance of payments accounts. I need to fix this typo. It's going to bother me. Surplus. Okay. So the next thing, this has to do with the net exports bit. Trade deficits and trade surpluses. We just, in last week, went over a budget deficit and a budget surplus, where the government might be spending more than we're making. Cool. There's also a trade deficit and trade surplus. A trade deficit means that we are purchasing more from other countries than other countries purchase from us. Effectively, you could label this as like you're losing trade. That's how people typically say it as. Where imports exceed exports, more money is leaving your economy than coming in through international trade. America almost always operates in a trade deficit. This is primarily because goods, specifically, we import those incredibly heavily, and we don't export those as heavily. So we're almost always in a trade deficit. A trade surplus would mean that you are exporting more than you're importing. You're sending out more goods than you are bringing in. If you're in a trade deficit, net exports is falling. If you're in a trade surplus, net exports is rising. Is a good way to think about this. Now, these situations are going to be imperative to our balance of payments accounts as well as our foreign exchange graph, the next graph for the unit. So those are going to be big terms that show up quite a bit there. So keep an eye out for these two words. Deficit just means that we're losing trade. We're importing more than we're exporting. Surplus means we're gaining because you're surplus, you have extra. You're exporting more than you're importing. So the balance of payments accounts. Boy, howdy, can I tell you, things in economics that students forget the fastest. This is up there. This and crowding out are two of the things my students learn in a day, and then it just goes whoop, and then whoop, right out the other ear. They instantly forget it. It's awesome. So careful. Put like a little star next to this in your notes to say like, be sure to study this one. You'll forget it. Just write that down because you will. Trust me, you do. It never doesn't come up very fluidly with other stuff. It's very on its own. So a country's balance of payments accounts is an accounting thing. Weird. It's a summary of all of our transactions with other countries. So whenever we make a deal with another country, whenever you buy a good from China, it gets marked on our balance of payments accounts. It's like, okay, that transaction is money leaving our economy. And there's two accounts in that balance of payments sort of document. There is the current account and the financial or capital account. I'm going to call it financial account. You can see either word for it. So I like the word financial account more, but on the AP exam, if you see the word capital account, same thing. Don't get thrown off by that. The current account has four big things. You can call it technically three if you wanted to, but four big things. Exports and imports are listed there. So if we sell a car over to Spain, boom, that goes in the current account. If you go buy a marker that was made in Taipei, sick, import, negative. So positive and negatives. It records your balance of trade, which is that whole trade deficit, trade surplus. That's your balance of trade. It records that. It also records two other things that are very important. Net investment income and net transfers. So net investment income is money that we make off of investments overseas, and it's a net because foreigners making money off of investments here would be subtracted from that. By investments, I mean like if you were to put your money in a Swiss bank account. It's a phrase people have heard before, right? If you were to put your money in a Swiss bank account and collect interest off of that account, sick. That's net investment income. That is the country of Switzerland is putting more money into an American person's pocket. Technically, that money is in the Swiss bank, but the American person would then be able to take that money out and spend it here. So that's seen as a win or a gain for us. That's a positive. A net investment income thing that would be a negative would be like if a foreigner had their money in an American bank and collected interest on it and the money was being sent over there, right? Now there's still positives, like a foreigner puts money into an American bank, and that money can go through like the money creation process, and money supply stuff can happen. So it's still like a not necessarily a bad thing, but it's listed as a negative here because it would be money leaving our economy whenever they withdraw it. Net transfers have to do with the idea of money being sent overseas in a more direct way. This can be in the form of government aid. So like when a country is having a really rough go of it, this happens typically in places like South America or Africa, where we have fairly neutral to generally positive political leanings with a lot of those countries where we want to help out when we can. I think a humanitarian crisis in like Ethiopia happens, which has happened before. We might send like $15 million in food and supplies and water over to Ethiopia, right? Good gesture. That's a good idea. It does count as a negative here because that is money leaving our economy. That's $15 million that is gone. So it's listed as a negative. Additionally, it also would include, and this is an important thing to think about, remittances. Now that's a word you might not have heard since maybe AP Human if you took it. But you've heard of this concept, which is an immigrant comes to this country, starts working here, and sends money to their family back in their home country. That is a net transfer. That is money being sent directly out of this country to another. That would be a negative. An example of a positive would be like a lot of expatriates, people who were serving in the armed forces in America, move overseas for a period of time, still work over there, make money over there, and then send their money back here. An example would be my dad, actually. My dad was a U.S. Marine, and after retiring from the Marines, lived in places like Abu Dhabi and Thailand, working for radar tech places and teaching and stuff like that. And he would send his money back here for me and my brother and my mom to help us spend on stuff. So that would work as a net transfer positive, where money is flowing into our economy. Cool? So you've got exports and imports, you know what that is. You've got net investment income, which is money made off of investments, literally in the form of usually like things that accrue interest is what I usually label that as overseas. And net transfers, which is like government aid and remittances. Those are the things I'm looking at. It's a lot, I know. The financial account has only really one thing in it, but it's very vague and open, and people have a hard time with it. It's the difference between a country's sale of assets to foreigners and its purchase of assets from foreigners. Now, this is almost always physical assets. There are the occasional financial assets that this works with, like the occasional bond or stock can also come into the financial account, theoretically, although most of those are labeled under the investment income side. It's tricky. So in the AP exam's eyes, I almost always list the sale of assets here as physical assets. So things like real estate. If an American company starts buying up land in a foreign country to build a new factory, cool, that is money from America going to another country, but it's not on an export or an import. They're not bringing the land here. They're buying a thing in another country that will have some international say. So that will be a financial account thing. They're buying an asset, land, and they're going to use that to make stuff. When there's a McDonald's that opens up in Japan, okay, they buy up a spot for real estate to build the McDonald's. Great, financial account. Goes there. If a Chinese developing company buys up land in America to build houses, a good example of that in our local community is there's a housing development about 20 minutes from where I live that some of my students live in called Harvest. That's the name for the thing. Technically, if you go through like the full financial listings of it, the company that bought the land to do that development is actually a Chinese company. So some of that money that the residents of Harvest are paying for their rent and stuff like that, or paid for their house, actually ends up in China. Or there's a movie theater here, but it's a Cinemark movie theater, but it was technically created by a Chinese developer. Cool. Financial account, money, asset. So whenever it's a business or land and stuff like that, something physical, tangible that exists in that country that can then make money for another country, that's financial account. It's tricky, I know. When it says assets, you want to jump to like stocks and bonds, and while some of those are included there, it's actually very finicky on what is and isn't. Generally, on the AP exam, or at least how College Board views it in this, almost all financial assets are in investment income, and physical assets are in the financial account. Boy, howdy, is that terrible naming conventions. Okay. Additionally, and this is an important note, that's why it's bolded and underlined, as a measure of accounting, when we talk about accounting, it's the idea of like assets equal liabilities is a very common term you see. That showed up on our bank balance sheet thing too. If any of you students have taken an accounting class, you would have heard this, where the money going in should equal the money going out. That applies internationally too. And there's an explanation for it. It's kind of beefy. It would take me a good 20 minutes to just explain this entire process, and I'm not going to make you watch another 20 minutes if you don't want to. If you just search Khan Academy balance of payments accounts, in one of his videos, he does a full explanation on how they offset. The AP exam doesn't ever ask how they offset, though, so just know that your current and financial account will offset one another. If you've got a deficit, if you're negative 800 billion on your current account, you should be positive 800 billion on your financial account. They offset each other. If we're thinking like the bank balance sheet, how both sides equal each other, same thing here. Your current and financial account should offset each other. Negative 800 in one, positive 800 in the other, cancel out. It's a fairly complex reasoning. It's not that you can't understand it, it's just that you don't necessarily have to understand it, so I don't teach it because it just takes a while and it's not always important. And lastly, there's like two more things about balance payments accounts. whenever we're talking balance of payments accounts and transactions like, hey, a person buys goods from Mexico, hey, a company buys land in America, hey, an American transfers money to their family overseas in Europe, you want to know, importantly, if that transaction is a gain or a loss. If you're making money or losing it. If you are losing money, if money is leaving your economy, if the transaction is going to require you to give up dollars and another currency is going to be used at the end of it, it is a debit. It's negative. So if Hershey's buys chocolate from Brazil, like cocoa from Brazil, they will end up having to use the Brazilian currency at the end of the day to do the transaction, so it's a debit. Money is leaving America, being converted to another currency. If it's earning us for foreign currency, so like if Toyota, a Japanese company, buys U.S. steel to manufacture cars, they pay with yen, gets converted to dollars, we're gaining money, it's a credit. Now, it says the foreign currency thing here, people tend to get confused by. Just think, if we're gaining money, just overall concept of money, credit. If we're losing money, overall concept of money, debit. It gets tricky because the currency thing, people are like, what? Oh, which currency is it? It's like, are we getting money? Yes, credit. Are we losing money? Debit. Yes. Sick. It's just the technical definition. So if they throw that at you on the AP exam, it's like, well, that's what it means. But where the money is what matters. Cool. Some practice. Let me make my head really small. I'll put it down here. So, quick practice. I've got 8 total scenarios, and then so I'll show you these 4 and then the next 4. I want you to pause the video and go through each of these scenarios and use the American perspective for this. So we are America, and then this is happening. Tell me if it's a credit or a debit, and then if it would be listed in the current or financial account. So if it's credit or debit, just means if America is gaining or losing money. It's current account if it's one of those 4 things: exports, imports, investment income, and transfers, which, yes, you need to know the vocab there. And if it's financial account, it's an asset, a physical asset, something that we have in this country that we can then use to make stuff. Make money. So just go through these 4 scenarios, tell me which 2 boxes do I check across. You're just doing like little check boxes for it. So pause the video and go. Let me pull up the Epic Pen because I literally just can't possibly remember to open that thing before. There we go. I don't need the update. Let's use the big highlighter and a black one. Okay. So first scenario. I'm going to go through them, so pause them if you want to try them yourself first. First scenario, Harley-Davidson, American company, the bike company, purchases $25 million in production machinery from a Japanese company. Okay. Credit or debit? So is money coming into or leaving our economy? Well, they're buying $25 million in machinery from a Japanese company, so money is going from Harley-Davidson to the Japanese company, so money is leaving America. That's a debit. Is it current or financial account? Okay. I start with the current account, and I start with the first thing that I actually understand, which is imports and exports. They're buying the production machinery from a Japanese company. I'm assuming they're bringing it here. I'm assuming it's not like staying in Japan. They're not building a factory in Japan. They're buying the machinery from Japan. So I would assume they're importing it, which would mean it's a current account thing. So whenever you're doing this, the first thing I always check off on my list of like, is it current or financial account is it an import or an export? Because I knew what that was before today's lecture started. There's a bunch of other things that go into the current account that I didn't know necessarily were in this until now. I know what imports and exports are. Let me focus on that first. Okay, second scenario. Andre, U.S. entrepreneur, invests $50 million in a theme park in Malaysia. Okay, credit or debit? The money is leaving America here, so debit. Current or financial account? Is this an import or export? No. Is it investment income? Maybe. It says the word investment there, so it's possible. It's tricky. Because if he buys the theme park, I would say it's a capital account, it's a financial account, it's an asset. If he's just investing it, though, I would say that is investment income. That is investment income in that scenario. So it'll depend. If it were to say that he outright buys the theme park, if he bought the freaking theme park, that'd be financial income. Because now he owns that property and is making money off of it. That'll eventually be helpful for us. But if he's just investing it in there, like in the form of a stock, then it's current account. A Chinese company sells $1 million worth of berets to the U.S. Army. Okay, they're selling the berets to the U.S., so where is the money going? They're selling the berets to the U.S., so where is the money going? Well, if they're selling the berets to the U.S., that means the U.S. is buying the berets. That is a debit for America still, Yeah, that part gets students a lot. So that's actually a debit, and this is an import, so that's current account. So you're like, Mitch, we haven't had a financial account thing yet. It's like, yeah, I know. Most of the time it's current account, because there's like 4 things in the current account and 1 in the financial, so it should outlay it. 4, BMW pays $1 million to a U.S. shipping company, or shipper, to transport cars from Germany to the United States. Okay, BMW is paying America. BMW is a German company. Credit, love that. Current account or financial account. They're paying them for the service. Well, a service isn't an asset, so it's not financial account, so it should be current account. If you're wondering, it's technically an export. Services can be exported too. Imports and exports don't have to be goods. An export is any good or service that we produce and then send overseas. We produce the shipping company. We produce the action of shipping. They're paying us for it. So all 4 of these are current account things. That, and that are technically imports and exports. That is a straight up import. That is a straight up import worded tricky to try and throw you off. That is an export, but it's an export of a service. This one is net investment income. They can come in a couple of different forms. So we haven't seen everything else yet. Here is 5 more. You can't read this last one. I'm going to say it out loud so you can. It is buys stock in a Chilean ice rink company. Buys stock in a Chilean ice rink company. Okay. So we'll go through each, pause them again, and go through all of them. Okay, number 5 says, each month immigrant, yes, it's a pun, who recently arrived in the United States sends half of her paycheck to her family in Poland. That's a debit for the U.S. economy. Money is leaving our country. She was getting paid here. That money is not staying here. It's sending half her check to her family in Poland. That would be a remittance, which is a net transfer. It's a current account. Senor Ramos, there should be a mark there. I just couldn't figure out the symbol, how to use that. From Spain buys a shopping center in Florida. So a person from Spain buys a shopping center in Florida. That's a credit for the U.S. economy. Money is coming here. And that would be a financial account. That's a real estate purchase. It's a physical asset that Senor Ramos now has that he is making money off of. So it's a credit initially. It will make us money initially because he is giving us money for that shopping center. He paid us for it. So we did earn money off that transaction. And it's a financial account thing because it's an asset for him physically. Bank of America pays $5 million in interest to French depositors. So the Bank of America is an American bank. Yep. Gives money to French depositors. Okay, that's a debit. Money is leaving us. Interest, whenever it's interest of any kind, that is investment income. So that's current account. And Sam Boney, that should sound like Zam Boney, that is a pun as well. U.S. ice rink magnate buys stock in a Chilean ice rink company. If he's buying stock in it, one, he's buying it, and he's an American, so we're losing money here. And the second thing is, if it's stock, it should be investment income. If he were to buy the entire company, that would be an asset. That is tricky, I know. I don't like it either. That seems purposefully confusing. The AP exam does like to avoid that confusion most of the time, so they tend to not say things like buying stock. I want to say it because I want you to be aware of the confusing nature of the balance of payments accounts in the real world. But if he were to buy the actual company itself, that would be an entire asset for him. That would be the financial account. If he's just buying some stock, that is a financial account thing. Technically speaking, if he bought the majority of the stock, because then he would be the primary shareholder, and he would effectively be the owner of the company, it'd be financial account. That's how like stocks could be in both. I know, confusing. Don't worry about that too much. The biggest thing to be able to clarify is credit or debit, good. If it's a physical asset like a shopping center, like real estate, it should be in the financial account. If it's just about anything else, but specifically imports and exports, investment income, and transfers, then it's current account. Those are your big things. I know, it's tricky. And the last thing on the current account. This is specifically on the current account. And this also has to do with your net exports and your trade deficit stuff. So there are 2 things you want to be aware of that will affect your current account, namely by affecting net exports. Interest rates. If interest rates climb, we've talked about this already, if interest rates climb, spending levels in your economy go down because you can't borrow and spend as much. There's less overall spending in your economy, right? Cool. Well, if we're spending less, that would include imports, right? If there's less overall spending, if our economy is making less money, then you're going to see less imports too. So, an important thing to mark down here is that a higher interest rates actually helps your net exports. Makes your exports more competitive. It decreases ability of Americans to import goods, so it actually improves your current account. So whenever you see higher interest rates, you could make the argument that net exports will actually go up. Don't worry about that from a graph standpoint, because that will break your brain if you think about it with our graphs. Just worry about it from a current account thing. Like the current account would move towards a surplus if they had higher interest rates, because it would allow for more exports and fewer imports. A lower interest rates means we can spend more, borrow more, so we would also end up importing more, because when we're buying stuff, that includes imports, which would decrease or hurt our current account. Real income, so that's income adjusted for inflation. If that went up, people would buy more and import more, hurting the current account. If income goes down, people buy less imports, helping it. The basic idea is, if we are importing more, that hurts the current account. It hurts our economy to import more, right? Money is leaving our economy. So both of these things, there are situations where it allows us to import more or less. Higher interest rates, we can't import as much. That's actually a positive. Lower real income means importing less. That is technically a positive for the current account. Lower income is bad. But remember, in economics, there's always a benefit and a cost. Lower income, bad, because people can't buy stuff, but good, because if you can't buy stuff, that includes imports. It means other countries aren't benefiting as much, so you can actually sort of keep more money within our economy. That's a technical win. So with those two things, don't worry about them from a graph standpoint. They don't bring that up, really, as far as I've ever seen, because it's way too confusing to try and mix current account stuff plus graph. Don't add accounting into graphs. But be aware that these two things, it's just based on people's spending habits. If people spend less, current account is generally helped. If people in your economy spend more, current account is generally hurt. And that's it. Let me go to the default with the bigger camera. That is it for the notes on the current account and the introduction to international trade. Your big things to make sure that you remember are things like, okay, protectionism and free trade are different theories. We are more protectionist, or we are more free trade than we are protectionist. There are reasons why you'd want to go protectionist, though. Things like protecting your consumers, infant industries, etc. And then additionally, when we talk about actual international trade, we keep track of all those transactions in the balance of payments accounts, which include the current account, so that's net exports, net investment income, net transfers, and the financial or capital account, where we keep physical assets, namely things like a company, if you were to buy that, specifically land, or real estate. That would all be listed there. Things you buy that are going to stay in that other country but make you money is almost always a financial account thing. It's going to stay there. It's going to make you money. Sick. It's a thing you actually are buying, though. So generally it's a physical asset in the AP macro course. In the real world, it's more complicated than that, because it always is. Oh, and additionally, your current account and your financial account offset each other. If one goes up, the other goes down. If one's at plus 500, then one's at negative 500, they have to cancel each other out. The reason for that exists, I don't explain it because this video is already 43 minutes. It would be over an hour if I explained that, and that's a lot. It's a lot to ask. I'm not going to ask you to do that. This is an entire class period in my class that I've just lectured. It's a one-day lecture for my class where it's like the entire class period worth of lecture. That's not too crazy for me. But that is it for today's video. The next video will be over the foreign exchange market, the final graph, and technically speaking, the final topic for AP Macro. So thank you guys for watching. Really do appreciate it, and I wish you all the best of luck. Thank you.